By the winter of 1943, the skies over Germany had become a theater of war that no Luftwaffe pilot, no matter how skilled, could dominate, and Oberst Werner Falken, a seasoned Jägerschwader commander, peered through frost-streaked cockpit glass, straining to make sense of the radar reports flooding his operations room. Incoming, a force of over 1,000 Allied bombers, B-17s and B-24s, their silhouettes already blotting out the horizon. Each machine carrying thousands of pounds of high explosives, incendiaries, and the concentrated hope of a nation determined to bring the Reich to its knees. And Falken, who had flown sorties over England, France, and the Russian front, had trained for dogfights, for tactical engagement, for the art of interception, but he understood, even before the first flak salvo erupted, that the scale, coordination, and technological mastery of this attack defied every pre-war doctrine the Luftwaffe had perfected in the Blitzkrieg campaigns. For the Allies had studied, measured, and mechanized the entire strategic bombing process. Navigation calculated with precision using dead reckoning and celestial fixes, formation flying drilled to perfection over months in training camps, fighter escorts synchronized across hundreds of miles of hostile airspace, and every bomber supported by a chain of maintenance, intelligence, and weather units that ensured planes were fueled, armed, and repaired before they even reached German airspace. And as the squadrons crossed the Rhine, Falken's radar screens lit up with more targets than he had ever seen, thousands of engines droning in unison, forming a vast river of steel and fire that moved inexorably toward industrial cities, oil refineries, rail hubs, and the heart of the German war machine, while below, civilians peered skyward with terror, hearing the distant thunder of wings that seemed impossible to count, and the anti-aircraft batteries, manned by exhausted crews who had worked nights and days for months without relief, opened fire in desperate waves, their 88mm guns spewing flak into the freezing night, creating deadly clouds designed to shred metal and scatter formations. Yet the bombers, trained in tight combat boxes, overlapped their firepower, protected each other's vulnerabilities, and advanced, seemingly immune to the hail of fire. A perfect marriage of American and British industrial might, tactical doctrine, and sheer mechanical endurance. And for every bomber lost, dozens replaced it, engines rebuilt, wings repaired, bombs rearmed, as factories in the United States and England churned out replacements faster than the Luftwaffe could destroy them. And Falken, seeing the approaching storm, understood the truth that would be confirmed in countless after-action reports and prisoner interrogations. The Allies had weaponized industry itself, turning production lines into a combat multiplier that made attrition almost irrelevant, that German air defenses, no matter how brilliant or brave, were now being confronted with a force whose logistical and industrial backbone was as lethal as its guns. And as the bombers reached the Ruhr, Hamburg, Cologne, and Berlin, they executed carefully calculated patterns, dropping incendiary clusters that would ignite firestorms, high explosive payloads designed to collapse factories, marshalling yards and energy plants, cutting off fuel, transport, and production simultaneously, while Luftwaffe interceptors scrambled in waves only to find themselves outnumbered, outgunned, and critically out-resourced, with replacement pilots scarce, fuel rationed, and operational aircraft a fraction of the attacking force. And the psychological toll on German crews, who had grown accustomed to defending against raids of dozens or scores, was immediate and profound, as they realized that for every plane they shot down, another would arrive in its place, relentless and unending, and civilian populations, previously insulated from the horrors of sustained aerial bombardment, now faced firestorms that could destroy entire neighborhoods in minutes, smoke and flames stretching for kilometers, streets reduced to rubble, hospitals overwhelmed, water and power lines severed. Yet even amid destruction, intelligence officers noted the systematic precision of the attacks. Each bombing run targeted war production, supply lines, and transportation nodes, crippling the German military's ability to reinforce, resupply, or reorganize. And while individual bravery, fighter tactics, and anti-aircraft ingenuity slowed the raids, they could not stop them, for the Allies had learned the most brutal lesson of industrialized total war. It is not enough to win battles in the air. Victory comes from projecting national production, planning, and coordination into the skies in such abundance that no tactical skill can counter it. And Falken, eventually grounded due to aircraft losses and fuel shortages, would later recall in post-war testimony that watching the 1,000-bomber streams descend was like witnessing the impossible. an avalanche of iron and fire that could not be halted by courage alone, that each bomber was a node in a network extending from the factories of Detroit, Seattle, and Manchester to the airfields of England. A system designed to maintain momentum regardless of attrition, and as the war progressed, Allied raids intensified. Cities burned in Dresden, oil plants in Ploiești were shattered, V-weapon production slowed in Piemont, while synthetic fuel facilities, rail junctions, and factories across the Ruhr faced near-constant bombardment. And for every city rebuilt by German engineers, the Allies returned with improved tactics, navigational aids, and heavier bombers, creating a situation where German planning, anti-aircraft defenses, and Luftwaffe operations were forced into reactive, desperate measures, often resulting in catastrophic losses, while Allied aircrews, operating under strict discipline, training, and rotation schedules, maintained the relentless tempo, a human and mechanical machine powered by industrial democracy, and historians later noted that by late 1944, the Luftwaffe's inability to contest these raids decisively, combined with fuel shortages, pilot attrition, and shattered production, contributed directly to the collapse of German operational flexibility on all fronts, while the psychological impact on civilians and military alike cannot be overstated. The constant roar of engines overhead, the approaching shadow of thousands of bombers, the inevitability of destruction, eroded morale, disrupted communications, and forced the German command to make impossible decisions, and as Oberst Falken reflected decades later in captured memoirs. We were no longer defending against men or machines, but against the industrial might of nations, a system that replaced what we destroyed faster than we could comprehend. When the bombers came, they brought not only fire and steel but inevitability, and when we saw 1,000 of them on the horizon, it was already too late. And thus the Allied strategic bombing campaign became the defining expression of industrialized total war, a relentless projection of national power into the sky, demonstrating that in the modern age, victory belongs not to the most skilled pilots or the most brilliant generals alone, but to the nation capable of turning factories, production, logistics, and meticulous planning into a weapon more decisive than any individual heroism. The Luftwaffe, no matter how brave, was forced to confront the unthinkable reality. Sheer industrial and organizational scale could overwhelm skill, courage, and tradition, and the thousands of bombers that crossed German skies were not merely aircraft. They were flying manifestations of a nation's ability to sustain, coordinate, and apply its full capacity, a system that, once unleashed, could not be stopped, resisted, or ignored, and their legacy, like the firestorms they created, would burn long into history as the ultimate demonstration of industrialized air power. By the summer of 1942, the Allies had shifted from sporadic, low-altitude bombing raids to sustained strategic campaigns aimed at the industrial heart of the Reich, and Major Karl Heinz, an experienced Luftwaffe operations officer stationed near Essen, scrolled through daily Luftwaffe intelligence reports with growing unease, noting the increasing frequency of RAF night raids and American daylight attacks that challenged every assumption of German air defense planning for what had once been. Manageable formations of a few dozen bombers had evolved into large, coordinated streams, each carefully navigated by Pathfinder squadrons marking targets with flares and incendiaries, and the early raids revealed brutal truths to German command. Despite superior aircraft like the Messerschmitt Bf 109 and the Focke-Wulf Fw 190, despite well-trained fighter pilots and meticulously planned defensive zones, the Allies were leveraging numbers, navigation, and industrial backing to achieve effects far beyond anything Falken or his contemporaries had encountered, and the initial shock was compounded by technological innovations such as G-navigation, oboe systems, and H-2S radar, allowing bombers to locate factories, rail yards, and refineries with a precision previously considered impossible at night, and German flak batteries, though deadly in theory, were overwhelmed not only by the sheer number of aircraft but also by decoy tactics, jamming, and the relentless rotation of bombers that ensured that even after hundreds were shot down, waves of replacement aircraft continued the mission, and as Heinz traced the flight paths over the Ruhr, Hamburg, and Berlin, he noted that the city's industrial outputs, while initially resilient, began to suffer cumulative damage. Synthetic fuel plants slowed production, ball-bearing factories faltered, rail networks were disrupted, and small towns hosting critical electrical grids and communications nodes faced repeated destruction. While Luftwaffe fighter wings, tasked with intercepting formations often hundreds of miles from home airfields, suffered from logistical strain, fuel rationing, and the impossibility of sustaining continuous patrols, and pilots like Oberleutnant Friedrich Kramer, who had flown over England during the Blitz, now faced formations of heavy bombers twice the size, escorted by long-range P-51 Mustangs and P-38 Lightnings that could outpace, outmaneuver, and outlast German aircraft, leaving intercepts only partially effective, and every engagement, every kill, every brave sortie highlighted the fundamental imbalance. For every plane downed, several more could take its place, rebuilt in Detroit, Wichita, or Omaha within days, crewed by men trained in assembly line discipline and strategic doctrine, while German replacements were scarce, increasingly inexperienced, and hampered by fuel and material shortages, and civilians, long shielded from air warfare's true scale, began to experience the terror of firebombing, sirens wailing as crews sought shelters, entire districts reduced to ash, and the psychological effect rippled through workers, managers, and local officials tasked with keeping production alive. Yet the Allies' approach was meticulous and methodical. No single raid relied solely on destruction. Each was part of a broader system of attrition, targeting not only factories but transportation hubs, fuel storage, and electrical infrastructure, with intelligence continually feeding back into planning, adapting routes, formations, and timing to maximize cumulative impact, and by late 1942, German command recognized a chilling pattern. While Luftwaffe defenses could inflict losses, they could not stop the advance of industrialized air power, a realization that would inform strategic decisions in the months and years to follow, as heavy losses, disrupted fuel supplies, and exhausted pilots increasingly forced German commanders to conserve resources for critical engagements, often allowing bombers to reach key targets with minimal opposition, and Heinz, reflecting on these early raids, would later write that we were not merely facing machines in the sky, but a system that replaced losses, adapted tactics, and projected the industrial capacity of entire nations, and the seeds of our failure were sown not in the air but in the factories and planning rooms we had dismissed. And thus the early Allied strategic bombing campaign demonstrated a new principle of modern warfare. Victory would come not through isolated heroism or superior fighter aircraft, but through the relentless, coordinated application of industrial, technological, and human resources at a scale no conventional defense could counter. And when the Luftwaffe finally realized that formations of hundreds, and eventually thousands, of bombers could arrive day after day, night after night, the psychological and operational impact was profound, instilling a sense of inevitability, of unstoppable pressure that German pilots, flak crews, and civilian populations could not escape, and from these early encounters, the blueprint for total aerial warfare was set. Massive bomber streams, coordinated with intelligence, fighter escorts, electronic navigation, and logistical depth, overwhelming not just the guns and fighters of the enemy, but their very capacity to resist, adapt, or recover, a lesson that would reach its apogee in the later raids over Hamburg, Dresden, and the Ruhr, when the Luftwaffe, exhausted, outnumbered, and under-resourced, could only watch as Allied industrial might rain destruction from above, and in the end, the German officers and civilians alike would come to recognize that the war in the air was no longer a contest of skill or courage, but of scale, production, and coordination. And when the Luftwaffe saw the first 1,000 bomber raids forming over their cities, it was already too late to stop the inevitable. By 1943, the Allies had perfected a terrifying choreography in the sky, transforming raw industrial output into a precision weapon, and Luftwaffe officers like Oberst Heinrich Brandt, responsible for coordinating fighter responses over the Ruhr, could barely comprehend the scale and discipline required to move hundreds, then thousands of bombers in coherent formations that maximized defensive firepower while minimizing individual losses, for early raids had revealed a brutal lesson. Bombers, flying alone or in loose groups, were sitting ducks, and losses were unsustainable. Yet through rigorous training, the Allies had developed the combat box formation, a layered lattice of overlapping fields of fire in which each B-17 or B-24 protected its neighbor, and Pathfinder units marked targets with incendiary flares, guiding waves of aircraft with almost surgical precision, while long-range fighters like the P-51 Mustang and P-38 Lightning now accompanied these formations deep into German airspace, intercepting Luftwaffe fighters before they could engage the vulnerable bombers, and the Germans quickly realized that shooting down a few bombers would no longer turn the tide. For every aircraft destroyed, 2 more were already in the air or rolling out of American and British factories, fully armed, fully fueled, and ready to repeat the mission, and as Brandt traced the flight paths of successive raids, he noted patterns in timing, spacing, and altitude that demonstrated meticulous planning. Waves of bombers approached in calculated intervals to saturate radar coverage, confuse defensive sectors, and exploit weak points in anti-aircraft deployment, while the Luftwaffe, limited by fuel, aircraft, and pilot fatigue, scrambled to intercept piecemeal, often meeting only small fragments of the attack rather than its full force, and the impact on German cities was immediate and harrowing. Industrial zones suffered repeated destruction. Transportation networks were severed. Fuel depots exploded, electricity grids faltered, and workers struggled to maintain production, only to have their repairs destroyed in subsequent raids. A vicious cycle that German planners could neither counter nor fully predict, while Allied intelligence continuously analyzed results, recalibrated bombing altitudes, angles, and ordnance mixtures, learning from each mission to increase effectiveness and reduce bomber losses, and German pilots, including experienced aces like Feldwebel Dietrich Krauss, noted that American crews were disciplined beyond expectation. They maintained formation under flak, executed evasive maneuvers when fighters attacked, and coordinated radio communications with precision, while every bomber carried multiple redundant navigational aids, spare radios, and emergency procedures, all backed by a logistical network that ensured rapid replacement of lost aircraft, trained crews, and ammunition, so that raids became continuous, relentless, and inevitable. And Brandt, reviewing post-raid reports, recognized the strategic genius behind the industrial approach. Whereas the Luftwaffe had focused on tactical victories, dogfights, and elite squadrons, the Allies treated the sky as an extension of their factories, each mission a production line application in the theater of war, and by mid-1943, raids expanded in scale. Formations of 500 bombers, 750 bombers, eventually over 1,000 at a time, creating a terrifying sight on the radar screens and skies above. Germany, a river of steel stretching as far as the eye could see, engines roaring in unison. Their combined defensive firepower making interception deadly, their coordinated timing ensuring maximum saturation of flak zones, and the Luftwaffe's response, constrained by fuel shortages, pilot attrition, and lack of long-range escort capability until 1944, was increasingly ineffective, forcing German planners into desperate innovations such as wild sow night fighter tactics, radar-guided interceptions, and mass deployment of Me-262 jet fighters. Yet these measures arrived too late and in insufficient numbers to offset the scale of Allied operations, and as cities like Hamburg, Cologne, and Essen felt the repeated pounding of formation after formation, the cumulative effect on infrastructure, morale, and production became devastating, with firestorms consuming entire districts, transportation hubs paralyzed, and industrial output crippled despite heroic efforts to maintain it, while the psychological toll on German civilians and airmen was profound, instilling a sense of inevitability that each raid could arrive anywhere, at any time, and in overwhelming numbers. And from these early experiences, Luftwaffe intelligence officers began to recognize a chilling truth. The Allies had transformed industrial capacity, navigation technology, discipline training, and tactical coordination into a single, unstoppable weapon, and when formations of 1,000 bombers eventually darkened the skies over the Ruhr, the Rhine, and Berlin, it was not merely a bombing run. It was the manifestation of a nation's total industrial power projected with perfect synchronization, a mechanical inevitability against which no single pilot, no defensive battery, no city infrastructure could hope to prevail, and as Oberst Brandt later recounted in post-war interviews, "We were trained to fight pilots, to fight machines, but we were not prepared to fight systems, and when 1,000 bombers approached the horizon in unbroken columns, it was already too late to resist, for the war in the air had ceased to be a contest of skill. It had become a contest of industry, organization, and relentless, unyielding scale. And thus, through the evolution of formation tactics, integration with long-range fighter escort, and unending industrial replacement, the Allies perfected a method of strategic bombing that transformed the skies over Germany into a theater of inevitability. One in which the Luftwaffe, despite courage, skill, and tradition, was powerless to stop the mechanized avalanche of destruction raining from above, a lesson that would echo through history as the ultimate demonstration of industrialized air power and the emergence of modern total war. As the relentless waves of Allied bombers tore through the skies of Germany from 1943 into 1944, The psychological toll on both civilians and military personnel became almost as devastating as the physical destruction, and in Hamburg, a city once known for its bustling docks and intricate canal systems, local police chief Karl Meinhardt watched in horror as the first incendiary raids erupted into a night-long inferno. Firestorms consuming entire neighborhoods, twisting metal, reducing brick to rubble, and forcing tens of thousands into basements. And the cold streets of smoke and ash blotted out the moon, and the screams of the trapped, the terrified, and the injured echoed over the city while firefighters, overwhelmed and under-resourced, fought against a force they could not hope to contain, and similar scenes unfolded across Cologne, Essen, and Berlin, where ordinary citizens, men, women, and children, began to perceive the Allied bombers not just as military machines but as unstoppable agents of doom, and German propaganda, long extolling the invincibility of the Luftwaffe and the eternal strength of the Reich, struggled to reconcile the reality on the ground with the heroic narratives it had cultivated, as families huddled in cellars, rationing food, water, and warmth, listening to the droning engines above, while trained Luftwaffe spotters frantically plotted incoming raid patterns, only to discover that the Allies had perfected navigation and timing to such a degree that even the most experienced observers could rarely provide adequate warning, and the psychological strain extended to German soldiers stationed far from the cities, as reports of firestorms, flattened factories, and mass civilian casualties filtered back through the chain of command, producing a sense of futility and inevitability. For men trained to believe in decisive engagements and clear objectives now understood that the enemy could strike anywhere, anytime, and in numbers that rendered conventional defenses almost irrelevant. And Major Wilhelm Krauss, a Luftwaffe intelligence officer stationed near Frankfurt, later recounted how entire regiments began suffering from anxiety, insomnia, and a creeping sense of helplessness, observing that even when intercepting bomber formations, the knowledge that thousands more were already en route undermined morale, while factory managers, engineers, and rail operators faced impossible dilemmas. Every production schedule disrupted by a single raid, yet already recalculated and overhauled for the next strike, producing a relentless cycle of damage, repair, and despair. And children, who once played in the streets, learned to associate the whine of distant engines with death, and hospitals overflowed with the wounded, who could not be evacuated fast enough due to destroyed roads and bridges, creating scenes of chaos and suffering that further eroded the civilian will to endure, while German leadership, from local mayors to high-ranking generals, grappled with the realization that no conventional countermeasure could truly stop the Allies' campaign, for the scale, coordination, and resilience of the bomber fleets, combined with industrial redundancy back in Britain and the United States, ensured that any loss was temporary, and as months of sustained bombing continued, entire social norms began to fray. Workforces were scattered, communications were interrupted, morale fell to unprecedented lows, and yet, the very persistence of the bombers, their relentless arrival night after night, instilled a chilling realization among civilians and soldiers alike that the war was no longer a battle of immediate tactics or front lines, but a contest of industrial endurance, systemic efficiency, and psychological fortitude. And even when local anti-aircraft units managed to shoot down several bombers, the survivors pressed on with unwavering discipline, while replacement crews trained in safe zones thousands of miles away were already airborne, ready to continue the attack. And the once proud Luftwaffe, its pilots exhausted, outnumbered, and increasingly inexperienced due to attrition, could only respond piecemeal, often intercepting only fragments of the attack while the bulk of the formation struck industrial or civilian targets unhindered, producing a creeping sense of inevitability in German cities that the destruction would continue indefinitely. And in diaries recovered after the war, citizens recounted nights spent in fear, mornings spent clearing rubble, and weeks waiting for electricity, water, and food to return, only to have subsequent raids undo all progress, creating a psychological cycle of hope and despair that weakened the German home front as effectively as the bombs weakened the physical infrastructure. And military observers noted that morale collapses often coincided with tactical failures. Entire units hesitated, defensive measures faltered, and commanders struggled to maintain cohesion, all while understanding that the Allies' strategy was designed not just to destroy material targets but to break the will to resist. And as Major Krauss concluded in his post-war memoirs, "We were no longer fighting airmen. We were witnessing the projection of a nation's industrial soul into the sky, a force so methodical, so inexorable, and so coordinated that resistance was not impossible. It was unimaginable. And by late 1944, with bombers capable of thousands of sorties per month, accompanied by long-range escorts and guided by ever-improving navigation and reconnaissance, the Allies had perfected not only a method of physical destruction but a psychological weapon, demonstrating that modern warfare was as much about endurance, industrial depth, and systemic execution as it was about courage, tactics, or heroism. And when the Luftwaffe and German civilians finally saw the formations of 1,000-plus bombers approaching en masse, it was not merely a battle to shoot down aircraft or save cities. It was a confrontation with the inevitability of modern industrial warfare, and at that moment, the scale of Allied air power crystallized in every mind. Resistance could slow, perhaps, but could not stop the storm, and when the engines droned overhead, when flares and incendiaries lit the sky, when entire neighborhoods burned, German officers, pilots, and citizens alike realized a profound truth. The war in the air had transcended machines and tactics. It had become a war of production, coordination, and inexhaustible national will, and for those who witnessed it, the lesson was devastatingly clear. When the Luftwaffe saw 1,000 bombers coming, it was already too late. The relentless pounding of German industrial centers by Allied bombers from 1943 through 1945 did more than flatten cities. It struck at the very heart of the Wehrmacht's ability to fight, and as Oberst Walter Heinemann, an armaments inspector in the Ruhr, later recounted, each successive raid produced a cumulative effect far beyond the destruction of buildings or machinery, for factories that survived one night were damaged enough to reduce production efficiency by half. Transportation networks were severed so that raw materials could not reach the assembly lines, and power grids failed intermittently, leaving assembly machines idle, and the Luftwaffe itself, tasked with defending key industrial targets, was caught in a Sisyphean cycle of scrambling to intercept waves of bombers while being simultaneously drained of experienced pilots, fuel, and replacement aircraft, and German generals, including Field Marshal Albert Kesselring and Oberst Heinrich Brandt, realized that even the most brilliant tactical maneuvers could not compensate for the systemic breakdown of production, as every tank, gun, or aircraft lost in battle became irreplaceable when the factories that built them were leveled or disrupted, and civilian workers, often conscripted into auxiliary labor or relocated under constant threat, struggled to maintain output under night raids, while transportation hubs, rail lines, and bridges, the arteries of supply, were repeatedly destroyed, despite heroic efforts to. Then they could be replenished, and fuel shortages crippled armored and mechanized units, creating a vicious cycle in which operational capacity and logistical sustainability were inseparable, and officers like General Feldmarschall von Rundstedt, overseeing defenses in Western Europe, noted with mounting alarm that the Germans were losing not only the ability to defend cities but the ability to field effective combat units. As newly trained pilots arrived with insufficient hours, tanks lacked spare parts, and artillery units waited weeks for shell deliveries, while Allied intelligence, analyzing bomb damage reports, production figures, and reconnaissance photos, confirmed that sustained strategic bombing was systematically eroding Germany's capacity to wage total war. And by late 1944, the impact was evident on the battlefield. Armored divisions advanced more slowly, infantry units faced supply shortages, and the Luftwaffe's diminished presence allowed Allied air superiority to dominate, facilitating not only bombing missions but close air support for ground operations, and even when German forces attempted counteroffensives, such as during the Ardennes campaign, logistical failures compounded operational errors, with fuel and ammunition scarcity preventing the mass deployment of tanks, artillery, and mechanized infantry at the decisive moments, and behind every disrupted offensive lay the fingerprints of the strategic bombing campaign. For each destroyed factory, each leveled rail yard, each blackout and delayed shipment represented a systemic weakening of the German war machine, a grinding attrition that no battlefield heroics could overcome, and this realization permeated every level of the German command structure. Generals, staff officers, and even rank-and-file soldiers understood that the enemy they faced was no longer a single army but an industrial juggernaut capable of replacing men and machines faster than Germany could destroy them. And as Oberst Heinemann wrote in his diary, "We are no longer merely defending territory, we are defending the possibility of war itself," and the cumulative effect of the bombing campaign extended beyond immediate production losses, reaching into strategy, doctrine, and morale, For the constant threat of air attack, forced dispersal of factories, decentralization of supply chains, and relocation of key personnel, creating inefficiencies, confusion, and delays that slowed every aspect of the German war effort. And the Allies, fully aware of this interplay between production, logistics, and combat capability, leveraged reconnaissance, code-breaking, and intelligence to prioritize high-value targets, ensuring that every sortie maximized strategic disruption. And as General Major Johannes von Lewitz later reflected, the bombing campaign was not simply a war of destruction but a war of calculation, an industrial chess game in which Germany's most vital pieces, its factories, power plants, and transport hubs, were gradually removed from play, leaving its military formations increasingly isolated, undersupplied, and incapable of mounting effective resistance, while civilians, witnessing the endless streams of bombers overhead, internalized the inevitability of defeat, with thousands evacuated from cities like Dresden and Hamburg, yet many remaining to endure repeated night raids, enduring not only physical destruction but psychological trauma that eroded societal cohesion and diminished the workforce available for war production. And by early 1945, the results were undeniable. Germany's war economy was a shadow of its former self. Fuel shortages grounded armored divisions, artillery units were undersupplied, aircraft were scarce and poorly maintained, and the Luftwaffe, once feared across Europe, had been reduced to a fraction of its previous strength, allowing the Allies to dominate the air and set the tempo of operations across both the Western and Eastern fronts. And as Brandt, Kesselring, and other senior officers admitted in post-war interrogations, no tactical genius, no heroic counterattack, could compensate for the systemic erosion wrought by sustained strategic bombing, and the conclusion was stark, chilling, and unanimous. The Allied bomber fleets, their coordination, discipline, and industrial backing had not merely destroyed Germany's cities, they had crippled its ability to wage war, proving that, in modern conflict, the decisive edge belongs to the nation that can turn industrial capacity, organization, and logistical planning into a weapon of unparalleled reach. And when historians later analyzed the campaign, they noted that the combination of sheer numbers, precise targeting, and relentless repetition created an operational paralysis across Germany that hastened the collapse of the Third Reich far more effectively than any single battlefield defeat. For in the end, the Germans had not been defeated only by bombs. They had been outproduced, outcoordinated, and overwhelmed by the systematic projection of Allied industrial power, a lesson that would resonate in military planning for decades, cementing strategic bombing as one of the defining instruments of total war. As the Allied bomber fleets rained destruction from the skies over Germany, a deeper, more methodical strategy was at work, one that merged the devastation of strategic bombing with the relentless advance of ground forces. And in the planning rooms of Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, Generals Eisenhower, Bradley, and Montgomery oversaw a complex choreography in which every sortie, every payload, every reconnaissance flight was synchronized with the movements of infantry, armor, and mechanized divisions, ensuring that rail hubs targeted in the Ruhr or the Rhineland would disrupt German troop movements just as Patton's tanks thundered toward the front. And British intelligence officers in London's war rooms pored over Luftwaffe communications, decrypted by Ultra, to anticipate the timing and distribution of enemy fighter units, allowing Allied planners to direct bomber streams along paths of least resistance while simultaneously maximizing the impact on industrial centers, a level of coordination that created an almost symphonic effect in which bombers, fighters, artillery, and armored columns acted as extensions of a single, coordinated organism. And the results on the battlefield were profound. German reinforcements were delayed, fuel and ammunition stockpiles were destroyed, and armored counterattacks, such as those planned during the attempts to repel the Normandy breakout, often faltered before they could reach Allied positions because the logistical infrastructure that would have sustained them had been decimated from the air, and local commanders, from Field Marshal Model to divisional generals like von Rundstedt, reported in increasingly desperate communications that their units were immobilized not by the immediate firepower of enemy forces, but by the invisible hand of strategic air power controlling the movement of men and material across the entire theater, while reconnaissance photographs delivered daily revealed the scope of destruction with unflinching clarity. Train yards obliterated, bridges toppled, factories reduced to skeletal frames, and cities in smoldering ruin, each image reinforcing the grim truth that German operational planning was being systematically undermined before a single tank crossed the battlefield. And even when units attempted localized counteroffensives, the careful timing of air raids ensured that any concentration of armor or infantry was disrupted, either through direct destruction or the denial of fuel, ammunition, and reinforcements, and this integration of intelligence and air power extended beyond pure targeting to the coordination of deception and diversionary operations with dummy installations, fake rail spurs, and misleading radio traffic drawing German defenses away from actual objectives, amplifying the effect of every sortie. And as American and British bomber formations approached critical targets, fighter escorts and electronic countermeasures neutralized Luftwaffe interceptors, ensuring that Allied forces maintained the initiative while ground operations pressed forward. And the synergy between air and land meant that German commanders faced a crisis of comprehension. Even if they could organize a tactical response, the strategic tempo was set by forces they could neither predict nor counter, and this realization weighed heavily on officers like General Major Johannes von Lipwitz and Oberst Heinrich Brandt, who reported in post-war memoirs that the combined effect of bombing and intelligence-driven coordination created a sense of operational paralysis, as units were forced to defend against threats that were simultaneous, overlapping, and inescapable, while civilian morale deteriorated in parallel, as nightly raids undermined confidence in civil defense, destroyed infrastructure essential to everyday life, and magnified the sense that the Reich was besieged on all fronts. And yet, despite the chaos, the Allies' integration of bombing and intelligence operated with a precision that reflected a new kind of warfare, one in which industrial capacity, information dominance, and operational coordination were as lethal as artillery or infantry. And when historians later analyzed battles such as the push through the Ruhr, the advance across the Rhine, and the final encirclement of the Ruhr industrial region in April 1945, they concluded that the combination of strategic bombing, real-time intelligence, and the synchronization of ground and air operations had effectively paralyzed the German war machine, leaving commanders incapable of mounting coherent defenses or meaningful counterattacks. And it was this system, rather than any single battle, that accelerated the collapse of the Third Reich, as German units found themselves increasingly unable to maneuver, resupply, or sustain combat operations while Allied forces, exploiting air dominance and logistical superiority, could dictate the timing, location, and intensity of engagements, ensuring that each advance was reinforced, each objective supported, and each resistance point systematically overwhelmed, and officers like Major Wilhelm Krauss noted that this integration transformed warfare into a continuous, cumulative pressure that was nearly impossible to counter, a war in which time, information, and production became weapons, and by the final months of the conflict, the German High Command recognized that the combined might of Allied industrial output, air power, and intelligence networks had rendered traditional operational planning obsolete, replacing it with a new paradigm in which success belonged not to the boldest maneuver or the fiercest battle, but to the side that could sustain momentum, coordinate multiple domains, and leverage industrial capacity with surgical precision. And for the Luftwaffe, the army, and the civilian population, this convergence of factors crystallized a painful reality. The Allies were no longer simply an enemy. They were a system, a continuously moving, efficiently supplied, and strategically orchestrated juggernaut, and every bomber, every truck, every coordinated sortie, every decrypted signal contributed to a comprehensive operational domination that left Germany's forces in perpetual reaction, struggling to survive rather than able to dictate outcomes. And in the end, as German officers testified in captured diaries and post-war interviews, it was the seamless integration of bombing, intelligence, and ground operations, not any single tactical defeat, that had destroyed the Wehrmacht's ability to fight, proving that modern warfare had evolved into a total system of production, coordination, and relentless execution. And when the 1,000-plus bomber streams flew toward the Reich, when rail lines burned, factories crumbled, and Germany had no answer. For when the Allies struck as one coordinated organism, the German war machine, brilliant in tactics but fragile in system, could not withstand the weight of a fully integrated, industrialized, and intelligence-driven assault. By the time the last waves of Allied bombers had flown over the shattered landscapes of Germany, leaving behind rivers of smoke and ruins that stretched for miles, the cumulative effect of strategic bombing, intelligence coordination, and synchronized ground operations had done more than destroy factories or sever rail lines. It had systematically broken the German capacity to wage war as a coherent, coordinated force, leaving commanders paralyzed, supply chains fractured, and morale eroded from the officer corps down to the conscripted infantry, And in post-war testimonies, generals and staff officers alike admitted that the relentless pressure from above had created an operational reality they could neither counter nor recover from, as every attempt to regroup or mount a counteroffensive was undermined by destroyed infrastructure, fuel shortages, diminished air support, and the impossibility of replacing lost equipment in a timely fashion, and the psychological weight of witnessing entire cities leveled, production facilities rendered useless and vital. Transportation networks repeatedly destroyed reinforced the lesson that modern warfare was no longer determined solely by tactical genius, battlefield valor, or armored superiority, but by the ability to integrate industrial capacity, logistical planning, and intelligence into a single, unstoppable system of war. And for Germany, the lesson was devastatingly clear. When 1,000 bombers were coming, there was no heroism, no maneuver, no tactical brilliance that could prevent the inevitable. The war had become a contest of systems, and in that system the Allies had already won.